I'd like to start off just by welcoming everyone. My name is Carolyn Zielinski. I'm the Director of Asset Management for Grow America, which was formerly known as National Development Council. We just went through a very recent rebranding, so our new logo and name is on the screen. Our work focuses on homes, jobs, and community. We're founded as a national nonprofit in 1969, so over 50 years ago. We've been fulfilling our mission to increase the flow of capital for investment in low-income communities. We direct capital to support the development and preservation of affordable housing, the creation of jobs through training and small business lending, and the advancement of livable communities through investment in social infrastructure, throughout the United States. We also have investment in Puerto Rico as well. With that being said, I am going to turn this over to Kristen Ryan, and we will have, we'll be on video in a second, and we'll go through our bios real quickly before we, get farther into the presentation today. So more to come.
This is Kristen. What I wanted to go through was an overview of the goals for this workshop. So many of you may be coming from different positions at this point where you may already own or control some real estate and are working on the management of that. You may be thinking about buying real estate assets and what that means, or you may have inherited a real estate asset and making decisions. But the workshop is really to better understand what does it mean to be an owner and control real estate and real estate assets. So what's it necessary for you to know in that position as an owner, and what kind of decisions are necessary when you need to manage an asset? So we'll be looking at building owners' responsibilities. We'll be understanding the life cycle of a project. So all the different points through a project, from the point of deciding whether you want to take on and own a project all the way to disposing of it, selling it at the end of its life cycle, or at whatever point you are going to no longer be the owner of that project, and understand all the choices that happen in between during that phase. Help understand better what the different roles are of an asset manager versus a property manager. Sometimes those roles can get merged or may seem confusing as to sort of who's responsible for what. So we'll talk through that. And talk through when to look to third parties to assist you in those roles. And then we'll be doing Carolyn will be doing a deep dive on day 3 around budgeting and the financial reports that help you manage the asset, because there's so much of a story told in your numbers. So today we'll do the overview. We'll talk about asset and property management and the differences between, some of the key skills as an asset manager, and then we'll start into that life cycle I described. So what does it mean to take over a property? What does it mean when you have to lease up a property, if you have vacancies, both commercial or residential? And how might you staff a property? So we are going to introduce ourselves so you know who's speaking to you. I've turned on my video as well, so you see me in person, not just in photo. But my name's Kristen Ryan. I have a development firm here in Seattle called Barrientos Ryan. We do multifamily, so affordable and workforce and market rate residential development, and what I put in the broad category of civic development. So health centers, youth centers, workforce development centers, educational projects, really community centers, really across the board, to help a lot of nonprofits think about how do they turn what they do in their services and their mission into the built environment. I have been in Seattle for the last 10 years working. I was in New York for 20 years before that, and have worked in the real estate industry in a variety of roles. I'm currently a developer, but I spent a fair amount of time early in my career also as an asset manager and running a property management firm. So have experience sort of in all of those arenas. I am going to turn it over to Katisha as well, who has joined us.
All right, thank you, Kristen. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Katisha Atterbury. I am the founder and managing director of Urban Black. We are a mission-based real estate development firm here in Seattle, Washington. I am also a Seattle native, so I'm born and raised here. I got my start in real estate really early out of kind of when I was in college. Went to work for a small family-owned boutique firm, if you will, that both did development as well as property management and mortgage brokerage and real estate sales in one office. And then that turned into a 20-year career that eventually grew into commercial sales and then property management for the government agency, the Pike Place Market Preservation and Development Authority here in Seattle, which is the agency that owns, manages, and controls the 9 acres of historic properties under the Pike Place Market PDA. From there, I learned probably the greatest amount of knowledge that I have now, overseeing historical assets and them being both mixed use as well as some civic organizations, a food bank, a medical clinic, senior center, as well as a childcare center within that 9 acre of property. From there, I launched before I did that, I also did some capital project management on the Pike Place market redevelopment. It was an infrastructural upgrade project, capital project back in 2008. And then some early conceptual design and planning work on the waterfront project. From there, I started Urban Black out of a real need that Seattle had to approach development from a holistic perspective. We are a Black-led firm of 7, if you include our attorney, and we predominantly focus on mixed-use development in the Seattle area, surrounding neighborhoods, and then we also have a growing asset management and property management department. And so most of my discussion will be kind of focused there. Thank you for inviting us back, Grow America, formerly known as NDC. Appreciate the work that we've all done over the years and happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katisha. I'm Carolyn Zielinski. I was speaking with you, at the beginning of the presentation. Just again, wanted to welcome everyone and thank you for joining the presentation today. I am the Director of Asset Management for Grow America, as I mentioned before. So we're a team of 5 asset managers, including Lisa Beal, who's on the call with us today. Lisa has sort of very broad responsibilities when it comes to supporting our team and being part of our team. She's actually our analyst, so maybe there's something she'll jump in at some point and add to it, but mostly just as a guest over these next 3 sessions. I started out in the affordable housing industry, a very long time ago, more than 30 years ago, working for a local nonprofit developer, which was known as the Cleveland Housing Network at that time. So I was in charge of the finance department. When I left there, I went and worked with a private real estate developer who did commercial real estate development, as well as some residential housing developments, and then went to work as the chief financial officer for a hotel group, which was a great experience as well. A little different than affordable housing, but all good experiences. From there, I went to Key Bank to be the vice president of asset management there, and managed a team, again, with investments all over the country, very similarly to Grow America. Got to know what was then National Development Council through my work at Key Bank. Loved the team, loved the mission, really was looking forward to getting back into the nonprofit mission-based world. So I joined Grow America about 8.5 years ago, and I'm just very glad to be here. We do a number of trainings, throughout the year. Training actually is something very important to our overall organization. So we do economic development, housing development type trainings, in person and remotely. So just a little plug there for our training team. But I'm excited for us to get moving here on this today. Again, it's a series of 3. I know that not everyone can join all 3 sessions. So we'll miss you on the days that you're not able to make it. But, certainly you'll be able to go back and listen to the recording if that's something that you're interested in doing. We do have the chat bar on the right-hand side of your screen. You should see that. So if you have questions or, want us to stop and clarify something, please don't hesitate. I feel like we're a small enough group that we're able to do some of that live. And we'll certainly have opportunities to take some brief breaks. We're going to have some breakout sessions. You'll get to know some other folks and talk about, various topics related to asset management. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Kristen, and we'll get started going through the slides and learning a lot more about asset management.
So welcome back, everybody. I hope you have a little bit of a sense of who is with us today. What I started describing a little bit of this is what I spoke about before. So what is asset management? So asset manager is, at the end of the day, the task of representing the role of the owner in the management of a property. So you are the caretaker of the responsibilities and the risks that sit on a property owner. You may be the property owner yourself, and you are taking on the asset management role, or you may have a third party asset manager who is also, who you are hiring to be your representative in making these decisions. And really, I use the terms, I very frequently speak to asset management and property ownership in these two terms, these buckets of risk and responsibility. So when you own property, you are managing the risks associated with that property, and you are taking on the responsibilities associated with that property. And so you'll hear me sort of share those terms in bucketing some of the things that we think about as we go forward, and in thinking about how you use the tools that we're introducing in this class to help you manage those risks and those responsibilities. So we want to make sure that you have as much information as possible so that you can make informed decisions if you're considering the purchase of a property, so you know what to look for. If you're thinking about taking on a property as an owner, you understand this piece of risk. Like, you may not want to take on something and then carry the risk for it if it has a lot of issues that are going to be hard for you to manage. We also want you to be informed to understand that once you have and you are an owner, how you're preserving the value of that and maintaining that value and helping that real estate asset serve whatever your program delivery is. So in some cases, it may be the provision of housing and safe and healthy and affordable housing. In some cases, it may be services provision, a health clinic, healthcare. And in all cases, we want to make sure that the real estate that's behind whatever that purpose is doing its job and being maintained so it's not countering your ultimate purpose. And then we're going to talk about when you might want to outsource these tasks and when you may be doing them yourselves. And just because you hire a third-party asset manager certainly doesn't mean that you as the owner are ever absolved from either the risk or the responsibilities. You, as anyone who is the owner, at the end of the day, holds those risks and responsibilities. You may be delegating management of some of those to a third party, but they still sit with you. And so we want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of when you outsource, what does that look like, and what are the elements that you need to be aware of and pay attention to in terms of the decisions that you make. Great, next slide, Nicole. So starting with, if you don't own a property yet, what might be the reasons that you are looking for one? And what are your goals if you do, even if you do have it, what are your goals? What are you trying to get out of that property? Because the decisions that you make in relation to that property may vary depending on the term of which you're going to hold on to that piece of real estate. Like I said, the real estate is really a vehicle to help you provide the program outcome that you're looking for. And so trying to understand and align what you're doing with the building and the real estate is really important. You might be looking at something short term. You might need to build it, which takes a little bit longer than buying something that exists. If it's just short term, you have very different considerations in terms of property condition or size, because maybe it's a starting place and doesn't need to fulfill ultimate goals of a bigger program. But if you are intending to grow, then you might be looking at something that you need for a longer term hold. And over the term, many of you may have heard, so real estate is what we call a cyclical industry. And so it has periods that go up and down and up and down in terms of value of the real estate assets. And that can be important in thinking about how long you can hold on to something and whether you can hold on to something through what might be a down period in the cycle. Because if you are trying to make sure that when you sell it, you get the same value out, then you need to make sure that you don't do that at a period of time when real estate values are depressed. And when you're doing it for your own business and your own programming, then a big piece of ownership is obviously maintaining control over your space and not being at risk of having your sort of programming and mission and efforts at the whim of a landlord. And so you want to be thinking about what does that look like over time? What are the variations that you might see in the growth of your business or your services organization? And what is the variability or flexibility that you may need in your programming? And how is that influenced by what you have going on with your building? Next slide, please. So decisions, right? Most of what this is about you as an owner having to make decisions about steps that will be the actions that influence the value of your property, influence the amount of risk that you have, influence elements of what responsibilities you're able to and willing to take on. And so these are the kinds of questions, right? What type of property do I want to be invested in? If you're doing this for financial reasons, if you're doing this for services reasons, what type of asset aligns with my mission, my needs, my values? So is that residential? Is it commercial? Is it mixed use? Where's the location of it? Is it big property? Is it small property? Those things will influence a lot of pieces. Sometimes it's what financial support you can access. Sometimes it's how many parties do you have to have at the table. Sometimes it relates to how big or small of a loan you may be able to get. What risk can you financially afford to bear? So as I spoke about before, with the market that goes in cycles, we are subject, the real estate, again, as sort of a vessel holding program needs, or holding individuals who are living there, holding services that are being provided, or nonprofit organizations that are renting, or businesses that are renting. Those cycles can impact the financial strength of the building, because if folks can't pay rent, when we had the COVID shutdown and retailers and restaurants were shut down for periods of time, they didn't have an income stream in which to pay rent. And so that influenced the variability of income stream for those owners. So you need to be really, really clear about what level of risk you can take on financially, either you or the organization that's looking at purchasing the asset or holding the asset. And then also this level of variability. It may look fine now, but if things got really stretched, do you have the wherewithal to access the funding that you might need if things were really stretched? We're going to make decisions and talk about making decisions about how is the property sourced? How do you find it in the first place? Does somebody tell you about it, or do you go through a broker, or is it an auction sale? You need to think about how is it financed? So how are you paying for the ownership of that property? Do you have a mortgage from a local bank here? Are you using one of the tax credit programs that accesses sort of institutional investor money to buy credits that are authorized by the federal government, and then have a sort of different set of parameters around them, particularly in relation to the responsibilities that you have for reporting and compliance obligations? And then how do you maintain it? If some bigger properties, sometimes your investors will have a requirement that there's a third-party property manager, and you've seen that property management agreement. But what does that look like? Can you provide staff to do maintenance of the property and cleaning and leasing? Does that need to be found from a third party? Are you cobbling together third parties? And what's important in doing that? What are your priorities for who comprise the residents and the tenants of the property? We'll do a deep dive into leasing, like I described, and talk a lot about what are some of the different issues and choices and decisions that get made in terms of what do your leases look like? What does compliance, if you have compliance requirements, look like? And so when you're thinking about who comprises that as I said, your program, your mission, your vision for the building, making sure you have full understanding of some of the decisions that come into play. We'll talk about staffing. So how much staff is necessary to manage a property? So it's really important, particularly if you're thinking about purchasing and owning, and very much so in particular if you're thinking about building on your own a property and you're an organization that is not a real estate organization by its nature in the first place. You do a different set of services. You are providing educational services. Then your staff on the staff of your organization already have full-time jobs related to that mission. And there's a lot of work and responsibility required in terms of focusing on and making sure that you have an eye to the management of the property, the real estate itself. And so you have to be very thoughtful about what are the obligations or the burdens you're putting on staff members if you think that, oh, I can just handle this with the people I already have in my organization. Which is part of what leads to the decisions about, do you outsource or do you partner? Do you find other third parties? Katisha just mentioned, right? She has a growing asset management and property management arm as an option, for instance, for people to outsource and partner with. And what are the things to consider when you're doing that? How do you make sure that your values align with the partners that you're looking at? How do you look at their experience addressing the priorities that you have for who are your residents or your tenants? What experience do they have in relation to managing compliance or financing streams that you're going to have on your own property? Next slide. And so here's my great word, responsibilities again, right? The responsibility for asset managers or the asset management team is to really meet or exceed the goals and the strategies that are set forth by that owner. So again, that is, the representation of the owner's values, the owner's goals for the property, and managing and seeing those put into place, monitoring them to make sure that you're aligning with them, making sure that if you're getting off track, if the property is getting off track, that you can do a reset to gain those goals. Those goals could be financial, they could be social, they could be a mix. So there are multiple layers to that. And it's really important that you have a clear sense of that. It's always important that your asset manager understand what the ownership goals are for the property, because that's what they are working towards. That includes long-term and short-term goals. So there are immediate ones, in particular, if you're taking over a property new and it's vacant or it's getting re-tenanted or released, that sort of what's happening in that period of time looks very different than if you have a property that's stabilized, has a lot of tenants that have been there for a long time, nobody is planning on going anywhere, in which case, and if it's in those cases, sometimes what you might be dealing with more is an older property that's starting to see physical deterioration of your property. And then what you're dealing with and trying to address is how do you continue to manage the revitalization and the rehabilitation of physical parts of the property that are getting too old or are stopping working and are breaking and need to be replaced. And how do you do that within the financial picture of the resources that you have or that you have to go seek to be newly available? And so it's constant in the life cycle of a project. This lens and this viewpoint of thinking about how do you manage towards the ultimate goal is, starts even before you're going to take ownership, so that you have a good, clear idea of really the viability of taking on ownership, and runs through, when that asset is no longer a part of something that is within your ownership responsibilities and management responsibilities. Next slide. And here's my risk. Here it's risk management. And so there are several categories of risk that you're thinking about. So financial risk, what are the financial operations? And as I said, Carolyn's going to go into a deep dive on some of the financial reports, profit and loss statements and balance sheets, and how you look at those numbers and understand the story that those numbers are telling you about the kind of risk that you might be facing in relation to the finances. Is something going on where you're losing revenue? What are the implications of that? Are there spikes in an operating expense, and how do you deal with that? And capital expenses, like I just was describing, if you have assets where you're going to have more older assets where you've got more stuff that needs to get replaced just due to the age of the real estate, then you're thinking about how do you fund those capital expenses and where does that money come from? The other kind of risk is liability risk. So when we talk about real estate, one of the things is it's like a fixed place. And so if you are the owner, anything that happens in that fixed place, if something goes wrong, you're the person that you're the entity, you're the owner that everybody's looking to. And that's why we look a lot and think a lot about the insurance that we have to protect the ownership from that liability. Nicole said I cut out. Should I restart? I'm going to restart at liability. Is that, I'm just going to revisit liability in case you didn't hear what I was saying. So liability, when we talk about real estate, it's a physical space, it's a physical presence. And what happens is the owner becomes responsible for everything that happens in that physical space. Even if you weren't necessarily the cause of it, you can be held on the hook for what's happened there. Somebody slips on the sidewalk in front of your building, they may make a claim and say, well, you didn't fix the crack in the sidewalk, and that's why I fell and broke my leg. And so one of the things that we look at a lot is the levels of insurance and what kind of insurance we have in place to protect owners from the risk of being held responsible for something that wasn't necessarily your fault. But the other aspect of liability risk is making sure that you aren't setting up things or aren't setting up a setting where your residents, your leaseholders, your guests, your tenants are at risk for anything. Making sure that you have your fire life safety systems, up to date, and your fire extinguishers have been checked and your sprinklers have been tested, and that you have safe access and safe egress, ways to get out. You aren't using the path to the exit door as a storage space. So there are a lot of things that you think about too, just in terms of what are the liabilities, because you are held responsible for what happens to people while they are on your physical property in your physical space. Next is operational risk. So when you don't have a clear path of what you're trying to do and you are all over the place, that will have financial implications, that will have liability implications. And so operational risk takes into account thinking about, do you have the staff that are necessary to execute on what you need to do? Do you have the opportunity? I talked about compliance before in leasing. You might have a financing and financial arrangement where somebody's given you money, government entities, the institutional investors that back the tax credits often have compliance obligations, things that you have to do and make sure that you're doing. Affordable housing, it's making sure that your tenants are at the income level for which those tax credits were offered and generated. And so you have to make sure that your tenants are falling within those income bands. If you don't have anybody on staff that's managing that, that is creating a risk for you. And so those are the ways that operational risk comes into play. And then one of the biggest, reputational risk, right? This reputation is a huge thing in the real estate industry. There is a lot of the industry that is built on trust and relationships, because these are big, long-term, if you're going to hold these properties, sometimes it is very long-term. And, what happens with those properties becomes tied to you as the owner. So leaving a property vacant in a area that really wants to, is trying to get redeveloped, and it being vacant and unmanaged and overgrown will have reputational risk, because you as the owner, even if you're trying to figure out what's going on, you as the owner will be associated with sort of not maintaining that area or the property, or thinking about what's going on in the neighborhood around. Not being able to pay or maintain your financial obligations will cause reputational risks that will then can also influence your ability to access financing at a later point in time. And this comes into play in terms of choosing your partners and choosing who your asset manager is and your property manager is, and tying back to, are they aligned with your values? Because if they are operating as your agents in terms of the management and interaction with your tenants and your residents, and they're treating your tenants or residents in a certain way, and that's different than how you really want them to be treated as the owner, then that reputational sort of impact of being a mean landlord is going to come back on you, not just on your agent. All right, next slide, Nicole. Let me pause for a quick moment. Are there any questions about what we've talked through today yet? Want to give a moment for anybody to raise a hand or, okay. As I mentioned before, right, there's a big cycle of things that we have these decision points on, and we're going to go in a deeper dive in all of these. So we talked acquisition or completing a new development, leasing, staffing, operations, management of the finances, and disposition, the ultimate sale of a property. We're going to talk a little bit, I'm going to speak really briefly about sort of where the differences come in for residential versus commercial properties, and what are some of the other things that you think about. Your due diligence in acquisition and development may mean looking at different things or different construction types, but the same list of things that you're looking at is pretty consistent across both of those types. In leasing, there are some very different leases, and there's some very different rules, laws, obligations, and compliance requirements from the financing tools that come into play in pretty distinct differences between the commercial leasing and residential leasing. And Katisha is going to talk a little more about those in detail as we go through. And as we do each of these sections, we'll speak kind of, here's what you want to be thinking about on the residential side for leasing. Here's what you want to be thinking about on the commercial side for leasing, some of the key questions. Staffing can also come into play. When you have commercial buildings, more likely those tenants have a greater degree of responsibility for their kind of maintenance and obligation within their spaces, and access to those spaces is often from outside on the street, not necessarily always through common areas in the building. And so that may mean that you need less staff to be managing some of the maintenance items that you might in a residential property, especially if there are a number of common areas or multiple buildings with multiple entrances, all the common hallways off of residential access. So they're just different pieces to think about in your staffing that may vary given the nature of what, again, your leasing and your role on residential tenants, are typically 1-year leases, as compared to commercial tenants, where you're gonna more likely have sort of 5+ years of a term on a commercial lease. And so you're not also having to think about that releasing and what's the staffing needed to maintain occupancy on a day-to-day basis. In operations, again, there are sort of two different ways of staffing, different ways of thinking about what are some of the responsibilities as an owner when you do have commercial versus residential tenants, and what's important there. In financial management, there are specific items, the balance sheets and the profit and loss statements are going to be very, very similar. In commercial properties, there is often a charge back, what's called triple net or common area maintenance charges, and understanding the management around those is different in commercial, where you are tracking and estimating expenses year over year and charging them back to commercial tenants. It's one of the ways that leases can be written with commercial tenants, so they are sharing the expenses. That's not seen on the residential side, but on the residential side, the compliance and the management of some of the other reporting about rents and income levels and tenant charts becomes a part of the financial management because of how it's tied to your financing sources. And then in disposition, again, like with acquisition, while the specific parties that you are engaging with may look different in terms of what if you're going through a broker, there are brokers that specialize in multifamily and residential often tend to be different than those specializing in office or commercial properties, but the checklist of what you're going through is still quite similar. So I am going to turn that over to Katisha now and let her talk in a little more detail about the practice of asset management.
Thanks, Kristen. And again, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to do something maybe just slightly different this year than I did last year. So this year, I am myself personally, and kind of what we're doing at the company, we're pretty knee deep in property management. It seems like I've kind of had this trajectory that started with property management and has grown into asset management. And now we're kind of going back down. And I want to say it like, down as if it's, a negative connotation, but our minds now as a company are wrapped around very practical knee-deep grassroots property management work. So I think what I'm going to do here as I go through the slides that have been assigned to me to present is I'm going to talk a bit about the topics, but then I may also provide quick references or case studies to outstanding issues that we're currently dealing with, and maybe kind of give you a practical example about what it looks like in practice. So if you all don't mind me kind of approaching it that way, then that's kind of what I want to do for today, if that's okay. So the slide, let's see what I'm looking at this slide. I'm sorry. Who makes decisions and how they're implemented in terms of asset and property management? So in my experience, I started off managing multi-family historic properties, which were comprised of both commercial as well as low-income residential. And most of that experience was at the Pike Place Market. So again, I might reference that. There at the market, we had a commercial team, an asset management team that oversaw, about 225 or so commercial spaces and about 200 or so low-income spaces. And we had a team of about 5 and then 1 asset manager. And I'd say like the day-to-day operations of the property portfolio relied on the property management team. And then the higher level decisions relative to long-term planning, financial planning for the properties, looking at them from building by building standpoints, as well as planning for capital improvement expenditures and maybe long-term planning relative to the existing tenants that resided in the buildings, and then maybe new up and coming tenants that we wanted to move in, and maybe tenants that kind of ran their course. And I'd say kind of the main difference, to put it in layman terms, is you can look at property management as day-to-day operations, and you can look at an asset manager as a long-term planning from a 30,000 kind of foot level, bird eye view level for a property or portfolio. Next slide. So some of the main differences in terms of actual functions from an asset management, again, perspective, you're looking at the long-term planning and management. So every property or every building should have a management plan. And the management plan includes both, day-to-day operations and functions of the property, as well as a long-term planning. For example, if you have a building, and I'll give you an example now, we manage a commercial industrial building in South Park on behalf of the city of Seattle. And one of the things that we identified early on is that the building is going to need a new roof. And so when you have a large capital expenditure, new roofs probably last, anywhere from 20 to 30 years, you make sure you include those expenditures in your long-term planning so that when the time comes to spend however much money a new roof would cost for that particular property, you have already planned financially for that property to be able to spend that money on the new roof, whether you're doing a financing strategy to take out money to finance that, or you have reserves in place to finance that new roof when the time comes. Again, most of the asset management function is managing the long-term plan as well as the risk, as Kristen had mentioned. Another kind of just practical example of a risk that we're doing now is we have a building, that same building I had referenced in South Park, where you're in an area where there are a lot of basements that were built in a lot of the properties, and they tend to flood a whole lot. And so what we've done in our planning is we just plan for the repairs, whether it's going to need a new sub pump, or you need some sort of plan to just address continuous basement floods. So it's not something that you want to do, but when you assess the type of building you're dealing with, and it's an older property and it's in a neighborhood that floods a lot, those are just some practical things that we have to do on our end to plan for that expenditure and repair when it comes up. Again, broad focus on outcomes, long-term strategies from an asset management standpoint. I think I kind of talked a bit about that. Developing policies and procedures. This is a good one. Again, from an asset management standpoint, what you're looking at kind of from here is, for example, let me just use another property that we managed. It was a 50 plus unit, 52 unit, low income housing building in the central district. And there were two income demographics there, kind of your middle income folks, what we call 50% area median income folks, and then you had your low income folks, which is 30% AMI in homeless population. And one of the things that we had to do in terms of managing that type of demographic is understand the low income folks, homelessness folks needed permanent supportive services. And so we had to make sure that there was a separate plan to support that demographic. And then also one of the major things we dealt with that building is that we assumed that property when there were a lot of changes in the Landlord Tenant Act here in Seattle and Washington State. And I'm sure most of you all are following, the changes being made, particularly now where the eviction process has gotten really difficult for landlords to execute in dealing with tenants who have been behind on rent. And then maybe putting together a repayment plan to get them back on track. So I think that one of the biggest, most practical examples I can use in terms of developing policies and procedures is your rent collection policy and procedure on how you are addressing rent that becomes 30, 60, 90 days late, how you're interacting with specific tenants, and then also recognizing that when you're working in certain income demographics, that there really needs to be more of a customized plan to support and address issues that might be more prevalent in this type of property, whereas that might very well not be the case when you're dealing with a commercial asset that you're managing. Just switching gears over to, and also just, I will also mention in that note that the development of policies and procedures, although the asset management maybe leads in that area, a good asset manager also consults with the property management because they work with the tenants on a day-to-day basis and helping to kind of develop and refine those policies and procedures. So just want to point that out. As far as property management, again, the property management team and our person is more involved in the day-to-day operations and management. For us right now, we have some vacant land that we're managing, and you would think that there might not be much to do with that, but there is. We manage vacant land on a very busy street on MLK, and over the last 30 days, I've had 4, maybe 5 kind of urgent matters relative to fence repairs where there's been some car accidents on MLK and cars have ran off the road and right into the fence. And so just as a practical example, they can tear the fence down, and then that becomes a security risk, not only for that property, even though it's a vacant site, but for the neighbor who has a building on their site. Now security has been breached, and dealing with folks accessing properties in a way that they should not be. They should not be on the property, but then also understanding we're in the middle of a homelessness issue, and people are accessing properties now more than ever in a way that they're looking for, places to sleep overnight and things like that. So that's kind of, another practical example of what you'd be dealing with in that particular situation, just as I'm referencing it. Property management, again, focus is shorter, 1 to 2 years out. I would probably refer to looking at the rents that you may be collecting in a multifamily, looking at tenants' patterns and behaviors in terms of rent payment, rent collection, and maybe, presenting it to your portfolio manager or asset manager on, what you might think be happening or might happen with a particular tenant if they're going to last in terms of, be on a good a payment plan to get back in good standing, or is this someone that we want to put on the radar for possible a move out, voluntarily move out. Again, neural focus on daily details. If you are doing multifamily, then you're probably focused a lot on repairs, maybe security issues, rent collection and payment, things of that nature. And then you're also tasked with executing the policies and procedures that are laid out through that plan that's developed from the asset manager and hopefully in partnership with the property management team. Next slide, please. Okay, so key asset management decisions and plans. And before I continue to go, I just want to say, hey, Kristen, Carolyn, you guys feel free to jump in. Again, my head is wrapped around in kind of deep day-to-day property management stuff. So if I miss anything in terms of asset management, feel free to just jump in and add whatever information I might have overlooked.
No, good.
Yeah, don't feel free. Okay, so key asset management decisions plans. We kind of talked a little bit about this already, but appropriate project staffing is a good one to consider, particularly, and it really kind of depends on what your portfolio looks like, what type of properties you're managing. Again, if you're managing kind of larger properties, multifamily, 50 to 100 units plus, more than that, office projects, then that staffing plan is going to look a lot different than say a commercial property or an industrial property where there's not as much activity relative to day-to-day tenant interaction, working with tenants, persons that reside within those assets, as it would be the case with a commercial or industrial property. So, for example, again, I keep referring to kind of what we're working on now, and in the past, we assumed 2 commercial contracts, and we're doing asset management and property management because we just don't need the additional staffing to cover that type of portfolio. So really kind of when you're thinking about acquiring a property or taking on a property, understanding the type of staff that you need appropriately is going to be key. A rule of thumb that I know of, and Kristen and Caroline, feel free to add here, but when you're working with multi-family residential, I think that the rule of thumb that I've heard or operated under is at least 1 property manager for up to 50 units. That's just the rule I operate on, but again, Kristen, Caroline, feel free to chime in on that.
Yeah, and I'll say the factors that come into play and have variability on that are, do you have what is the building like? If you have multiple buildings and multiple entrances that people come in from various different places, then it may be helpful to have presence in more sites than one, right? So there are things that come into play, really relate to what are the tasks associated with that property manager's role. So what are they responsible for really the interaction with tenants all the time? Are they doing the accounting? Are they doing the leasing? And so thinking about how to most effectively really engage tenants if you need one-on-one participation or sort of safety, security presence in a lobby. And how that works depending on just the physical layouts of your own asset.
Mm-hmm. Right. And thanks for that. And I'll also add some more color to that. I'll reference the 52 unit building that we managed in the Central District. So that was, again, comprised of, I want to say 34 of the units were the low income, 30% AMI and below. And then the 16 or so units, 50% AMI were about 16 or so units of 50% AMI folks. So the staffing plan for that looked like 1 property manager, 1 business manager. Again, this one is it was a LIHTC deal also, so there's a lot of compliance associated with LIHTC, as the LIHTC folks who are here today know. And we needed an entire business manager just to make sure compliance was together. So property manager, a business manager. And then because we had the 30% AMI folks, we had permanent supportive services, and we needed 2 case managers for that. So, and then we had 1 janitor and 1 maintenance person. So that's kind of just an illustration of what a potential staffing plan would look like for that type of property. Marketing plan and management plan. I'll talk about this kind of together. Marketing plan, it really, again, it depends on what type of property you're managing. And what kind of demographic you have in the property that you're managing. So let me give another example. So we assumed a 10-unit townhome project a couple years ago. It was brand new construction, and so we put a lot of emphasis in the marketing plan. The owner had a kind of some goals and objectives that they wanted to reach for the potential property, and so what we did was we customized the plan according to the property. We understood what type of income demographic, or the way we describe it as the buyer profile, even though they're not buyers, they're renters, renter profile, we'll just say that, that would be attracted to this type of property. And then we put together the marketing plan accordingly. So again, I think the first thing to do, one of the first things to do when it comes to a marketing plan is really kind of determine what your tenant profile is going to look like. And then think about where they're at and then how you will reach them. And so, it's pretty standard in terms of marketing. You can consider, various different things. Our marketing is pretty there's a lot involved because we want to make sure that we get the information out when we have new properties available. But it could look anything from putting up signage into in front of the property to putting an ad in things like Craigslist, and I think Facebook Marketplace is the new one that's getting a lot of attention. Listing it in, various periodicals or, real estate advertisement platforms. They're pretty standard. If you're really intentional about a particular tenant, then again, you can do things like referral partners to other agencies that have a network of folks that you might think, fit into that tenant profile. It really kind of just depends. And so it's good to have a marketing plan up front. Again, if you have a building that's, pretty much occupied, then you don't necessarily need to, redevelop a whole marketing plan. You maybe think about what's working and, think about how you want to improve it. But in terms of developing a marketing plan, I usually see that predominantly when it comes to kind of new construction and leasing up of new properties. Management plan.
Katisha, sorry, just to jump in on the marketing. It's for those properties that are new development too, right? If you've received money from Office of Housing in Seattle, they require that you're providing a marketing and leasing plan in advance. It's part of your financing obligation and loan obligation. And also, Katisha sort of briefly mentioned, right, being able to do what we call affirmative marketing, which is sort of targeted outreach in certain neighborhoods. So when there's a high prioritization, to make sure that you can, fill a new building with people that might be at risk of getting displaced from that neighborhood that they've been in for a long time, there can be the initial outreach, maybe very, very focused, just to neighborhood organizations and neighborhood outposts of where you get information that those units might be available for lease, prior to going to the more broad-based platforms that Katisha was describing as ways to really make sure that sort of whatever your affirmative marketing plan is outlining as your targeted sort of resident population can be focused on in that through those marketing efforts.
Mm-hmm. This is Carolyn. I just wanted to add that, from a fair housing perspective, it is very important to be able to demonstrate that you have reached out in a very fair and equitable way. So in addition to your marketing plan saying where you're going to reach out to, what those avenues are, it's also important for you sort of on the back end to, have a file where you've documented what you've done. I put an ad here. Here's a copy of the ad content, so that if there ever were to be a question, you would be able to prove that you have, in fact, reached out to a very broad audience, that you haven't targeted one particular population over another.
Thank you, Caroline and Kristen. Two very good points. We're operating in the affirmative marketing space ourselves, very much so, and being able to balance those two points that both Kristen and Caroline made is really going to be wise and smart for anyone who operates here in Seattle, Washington, and are working with the city of Seattle as it relates to their housing objectives and initiatives. There are ways to execute an affirmative marketing plan while making sure that you are adhering to fair housing rules and regulations and things like that. And so maybe that's a topic we can talk more in detail later on, but definitely want to highlight those 2 points that Kristen and Caroline made. So thank you. Management plan. It really just is a plan to manage the building. Again, it looks different for every property type. I think that, let's see, do we have Caroline, are we going to go, do you have plans to kind of look at a management plan and go into detail? I think we did that last year, but I'm not quite sure.
Yes, we are going to talk about that further.
Okay, so then I won't go into too much depth about it now, just kind of highlighting points, but it's a plan to manage the building. We're going to talk more in detail about it later, so I won't talk more about it now in the interest of time. Performance monitoring criteria goals. So I think that, again, from my perspective, one of the main performance goals just from my experience is rent collection and tenant retention. And so when you are kind of managing 225 so odd businesses, I'll just speak on the commercial portfolio. We look very closely at the rents that are being collected, because we do a lot of the overall asset management planning. And then, at the PDA, the budget was highly based on the rents that we collected from our tenants. And so looking at, what tenants are paying rent, the patterns that they're demonstrating, how can we help improve them, really being able to kind of monitor that as pertains to not only rent payment, but then also rent increases. Are we doing it on an inflation rate kind of basis, or maybe we have a tenant whose rent might not be in line with other comparable tenants, and we need to put a plan together to get them to where they should be. All those types of things kind of, go into, monitoring your rent collection and your tenants as it pertains to revenue generation. Reserve strategies. This is one that definitely Carolyn and Kristen, feel free to chime in on, but when you're doing financial planning from an asset management standpoint, you're looking at capital expenditures, you're looking at maybe you have to refinance the building at a certain point in time, and the note is due. You are putting money aside in a reserve account to plan for those strategies that are developed in the long-term plan with the asset manager. And so when these moments come where you have to spend this large amount of money, you just want to make sure that you have the money to spend it. And so strategizing on building up a reserve account to make sure that you are covered when that time comes is definitely something that you want to, every asset manager plans for. So there is a way to respond when that time comes.
And I do want to add that, your lender may have specific requirements with regard to reserves. If you have an investor in your property, they may have requirements, as well. So you just need to make sure that you're very cognizant of those requirements, and also, try not to nickel and dime your reserve accounts as time goes on, because again, as Katisha was saying, you want to really have those dollars on hold, so that if something larger comes down the road when the building is aging a little bit, you have the funds to pay for it. So if you try to slide some things through and maybe your investor or lender has to approve any withdrawals, you can't expect to be disappointed when they say no if you're putting through an invoice for pest control, or repairing one piece of a sidewalk. We're trying to think about it, for the bigger ticket items. So just be cautious with that.
And I want to acknowledge, this is a space, particularly at the beginning of purchasing a building, that can be really a struggle. And if you are just leasing up, then the tension of not having, not feeling like you have enough money in yet, or the revenue stream hasn't gotten stable yet, the idea of putting money aside for something that's going to happen way down the road can feel like a big tension. And so I think what's important is to make sure that you're looking at that. And as Carolyn just noted, maybe it's okay that you are, outside of investor or lender obligations, and I've even seen this in some lender things, where you may not fund that in the first 2 or 3 years while you're trying to get enough cash to be able to be in a place to fund it, but don't let it, it's really important not to let it slip off a map, right? Like, and it's really important to not sort of, you need to be intentional about saying, well, I'm not funding that for 2 years or 3 years, I must fund it in year 4, and then will I have enough kind of available? And there are reports called capital assessment reports or property condition reports that third parties on, you know, existing assets that have been around for a long time too, can come in and help you provide kind of a projection of when things are going to start falling apart on you and when they're going to need, and sort of what's the estimated amount that you may have to spend to fix and replace those things. And so there are tools to help you look at that. But this is exactly where you don't want to be in a setting. This is about that long-term value preservation. You don't want to be in a setting where you just have no money to do the things that you need to do, and your property falls into disrepair. That makes you lose tenants. That, you know, it's just sort of a spiraling downward. So
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
before we move forward with the budget piece on the list, Dawn has a question in the chat. And she's saying that she loves the strategy of affirmative marketing plans and recognizes the necessity of the transit-oriented development plan, and recognizing that this will greatly impact targeted residential audiences, especially underserved residential audiences. The question is, what are your best solutions for transit-oriented affirmative marketing planning?
And Dawn, can I ask for you to clarify, are you thinking about like a transit-oriented project that then, you know, you want to have drawing from its surrounding neighborhood, and what's happening is you're trying to make sure that happens, so it's not just getting interested parties that are coming from wherever because of the transit? Or are you talking about trying to leverage a transit-oriented opportunity to bring people in who've been displaced? So
I think both. How can you provide housing solutions in an affirmative marketing plan that does not displace residential audiences? How can you leverage targeted models? Is it through policy? Is it through electeds? How do you best provide housing solutions, especially since there are upcoming transit plans in place with alternate solutions? And while this could provide excellent opportunities for housing and marketing, how can we ensure that all targeted audiences are stabilized and thought of in this?
I think your question has sort of 2 levels of it, right? Because on the policy side, like you're describing, can that be, you know, a transit-oriented geography, right? Maybe multiple property owners, and so multiple buildings that would be looking at what are those leasing strategies, and that would need to get addressed on a more policy level than in order to impact every one of those property owners. The financing, you know, I think what City of Seattle has done specific work around this, right? And thus why those plans are inextricably tied to the funding that the city provides to the Office of Housing, is those plans. So they're looking at how are you managing anti-displacement, you know, sort of a condition of, if you're going to get funding from the city, then you need to align with sort of our policy initiatives around anti-displacement and outreach to surrounding neighborhoods and preservation of communities. And so I think that is sort of twofold. It is, how do you, and then it's, you know, ultimately to hiring, if you're hiring property management teams who really understand how to do this kind of marketing well, right? There's some knowledge and some, I mean, not so much nuance, but thoughtfulness and intention that has to take place in it, versus this is how I've marketed the last 10 projects, right? I put my ads in these 5 places and that's how I get my bodies. And it's really relationship building, right? And so how do you really boost and bolster the relationship building between the owners or prospective owners or future owners with new development and the local geographical organizations that have ties to individuals that might get displaced in those communities.
Thank you for answering that and answering that with intention and purpose. I appreciate that.
Yeah, Katisha, do you have some other thoughts directly on that too from your work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hot topic. I was part of the group that I like to think, kind of kicked off this approach of affirmative marketing when we were working on the Liberty Bank project years ago. We really wanted to target, people who had a tie to the historically Black diaspora of the Central District. And for those who may not know, or folks who are not familiar with the history of Seattle, the Central District is a historically Black neighborhood, and there has been, gentrification that's occurred. And so in an effort with the Liberty Bank project being a mission-based project and really wanting to provide opportunities for those who may have been displaced through gentrification over the years to be able to come back and live affordably in the Seattle area. And so one of the things that we really wanted to do was make sure that we knew where people were and what organizations or agencies that they might have been connected to in terms of, groups. For example, if that could have looked, and as a practical example, looked like people who were part of the Black Business Directory on Facebook. It takes, thoughtfulness and intentionality about identifying where people are and just making sure that the information gets to them. Whereas just traditionally, it's mostly been, okay, put an ad in this, periodical or that newspaper or that realtor platform or whatever. There wasn't much intention about it. And so the folks that we wanted to make sure had the information, we really had to think about where they were and to make sure that we got the information to them. Otherwise, they might not have gotten the information. So, I mean, we can probably spend a lot of time on this. And I think maybe, we could talk about it more when we get to like day 3. But I just want to be cognizant of the time because I don't think I'm doing a very good job on timing here on the slides. So, I think maybe Carol and Kristen, maybe we should talk, if there's an opportunity, more in depth about affirmative marketing.
Yeah. Sure, that sounds good. And you're fine on time, Katisha. I've already gone through to make some adjustments, so just keep rolling.
Just keep rolling. Okay, great. I thought I was in trouble. Okay, let's see, where are we? I think we're at point F on slide 17. Develop annual and long-term budgets and forecasts. So this is something that, the property management and asset manager does annually to forecast the budgets for not only revenues that are expected to be collected both through rents and then maybe also some service revenues if you're, managing a lower income building, but also planning for the expenditures that you're going to spend, which includes things like staffing, maintenance and repair costs, a budget for just kind of unforeseen items. If, there was like a break-in in the building and someone, broke the front door, the mechanism, just whatever it is, having a budget or a fund to support that repair work. If you, want to increase your staffing plan halfway through the year because, things are there's more activity in the building, the costs associated with a new, part-time employee or another full-time employee, those types of things you do annually with the asset management person, as well as maybe your lead property manager, and kind of forecast those costs. So I think in property management, and, Kristen and Caroline, feel free to affirm this notion, but if you could plan for and or foresee any and everything that could happen to your building, that is the wise method in terms of approaching the budget and forecast every year. There's always going to be surprises, but some of the things that you could plan for ahead of time, you want to make sure that you are thinking thoroughly through those things, because surprises aren't always great, especially in the property management world. So if you could mitigate any surprises as much as possible, that's definitely an appropriate approach to take. Developing capital improvement plans. We talked a bit about this already. Again, you're planning for any capital improvements needed through the building. Kristen had mentioned that there are tools that you can use, property capital needs assessments that third parties can perform, property condition reports. In fact, we manage a building. We provide management services for a client of mine who owns a building down or actually they're looking to purchase a building down in the Columbia City area. And the building is very old and very funky in terms of its layout and things like that. It's been subdivided and all those types of things. And so we did a recent capital needs assessment and a property condition report. And so basically you have what that looks like is, there are subcontractors that do this work, engineers, construction contractors, and they just go into the building and assess the condition of the property. So they look at things like your mechanical and your electrical and your plumbing systems, if you're going to need, upgraded plumbing systems in the building, if your electrical is all kind of wonky and all over the place and could potentially pose a fire hazard, if you're looking at, new HVAC that needs to be upgraded in the building, especially when you're working with, older buildings. For whatever reason, I tend to, fall into working with historical properties. I don't know. They probably think I just like dealing with the complexities of managing an older building. But particularly with older buildings, you're going to really need to understand the condition of it, because you definitely don't want to be surprised. And there are things that can come up that might have been quote unquote improved upon over the years, but it very well could have been just a quick fix and cover up. Particularly, a lot of older buildings are masonry built. And so there might be structural issues that need to be considered. The roof leaks are a big thing, planning for all those types of things. So when you bring in these contractors to make these assessments, and they're much better at seeing things that, sometimes property managers and asset managers are saying, they could give you a report on the exact condition of the building, and then also make recommendations for how you might want to strategize on future repairs that are going to be needed. We're actually actively doing one of those right now for our client who's making a purchase on a building who needs a lot of repairs. And then again, also, if they come back and say, this is going to be a couple, $2 to $3 million, that could really inform your decisions on how you're planning for the building, whether it's a purchase or also in your management plan. It needs to be incorporated in the plan for the asset manager to plan for how that's going to be addressed. Contract negotiations for services. So these are basically negotiating contracts for your subcontractors who manage, help you manage the building. So for example, if you have, let's see, what could I say here? Your janitorial, you have like a janitorial contract. If you decide to, provide maintenance services in-house, or you outsource maintenance services, just having an understanding of what the contract looks like, what it entails, what they're going to do, what they're not going to do, that's something definitely to, pay attention to. And then also, make sure that you're getting the services that you're paying for, understanding that their labor costs are maybe in line with the market, that they're doing a good job. I like to use people that are, have a good reputation, and then, are amenable to the property manager, and, basically have a mentality of teamwork that could, buy into wanting to make sure that the building is in really good condition, it's managed well, and really care about the work that they're doing. And so just looking at the contract, understanding kind of what services are going to be provided, what you're paying for, and then understanding the market in terms of what the cost of those services would look like. Lease versus buy decisions. So this is a good one, but I think, Kristen, you had a really good kind of explanation on, considering whether to lease or buy a property, or I remember last year that you had some really good insight on this point. So am I
Yeah.
right on?
I can't recall exactly what I said, but I think some of the things that come into play, like I was talking about earlier, have to do with what is your long-term sort of, what is your overtime plan for what you're doing? So if you are doing something program, if you are doing this for your organization's operations, and you know that those are going to scale and grow over time, and you're just starting, then maybe you don't want to encumber yourself with the same level of financial obligation at this moment while you're growing a project, and you might want to lease. And many of the things we're talking about, the things that we're talking about here from the ownership standpoint, then you want to keep it, if you're pondering this, or this situation applies to you, you want to kind of keep in your head then, well, what are we saying is the tenant side of that? Like what's the other side of that if you're not the owner and you're the tenant? Because those will be relevant to parts of these decisions for you, for your organization. And other people, it's a large capital investment, right? And it sits on your balance sheet, and it can either, sometimes it can assist in further borrowing. Sometimes it can really encumber further borrowing, depending on the nature of the financing you've received. And so it really has to tie into your longer term strategy of what you're doing, how important that location is for you, right? Maintaining ownership of an asset in locations that, as Katisha's been talking about a lot, your organization might be at risk of getting displaced, and you want to make sure that you're geographically sited in a place that you don't give up, then, ownership is super, super important. So I think there are a host of considerations that have to come into play. They tend to be pretty specific to really what is the timeline and the nature of the plans for why you're using the asset.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Kristen. And then, refinancing options, again, they kind of relate to that a bit. And again, feel free to chime in on this one too. When you have you have a mortgage on a building, and then you have, a time period where you're coming up and needing to refinance. And so I'd say just having a real good understanding of what the financial market is looking like for now, we're experiencing a lot of increased interest rates, which the cost of borrowing or refinancing is higher than it has historically been, through COVID, because the interest rates have grown. In my opinion, they're kind of back to what they were before we entered in a recession or so in the pandemic. And so just your cost of capital, is something to consider when refinancing, just making sure that the cost associated with needing to refinance is known up front, and then just exploring other multiple lenders to see what kind of deal they can provide when you're looking at needing to refinance your building when that kind of tickler comes up. Again, Carolyn and Kristen, you guys operate more in that kind of space, so feel free to add if need be.
You made some good points there. And I think when we did this presentation, 2 years ago, just encouraging folks to look and see if there might be, an opportunity on the financing front to improve cash flow by refinancing. And as you mentioned, and we all know, rates are going up so quickly that probably is off the table. But I think the greatest challenge now will be for folks who maybe had, either a variable type of a loan, or they've had a loan that had a shorter term that's coming due. And so there's going to be a big reality check going out and getting, new financing to replace something that's expiring.
Yeah, for sure. I keep hearing from a lot of my colleagues, the cost of capital. We're dealing with one of them now as we're going through a financing for one of our new construction projects, and the thing about this point is also good to know for property managers, because it also the cost of capital could affect, the rents that are charged, the fees, unfortunately, or the costs have to go somewhere. And so, strategizing on how to mitigate carrying over that cost to the tenants, if you're working on a project where you want to keep the rents low, there's a lot of strategizing as it pertains to, the strategy around refinancing the building, and just making sure that, costs are mitigated as much as possible, particularly in this market right now. Okay, next slide, please. I really have no idea how I'm doing on timing, so you
You're okay. I've got some adjustments. Don't worry.
okay. I feel like
I know we have a lot to say about these things, but
yeah,
it's the
yeah.
sharing of experiences that's so helpful to everyone.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that's as a student, I'm a lifelong student. I like to think I always find it helpful to know about like case studies and real world experience. Like, how does this, pertain to like what I'm doing now? So if that's cool for folks, I'll jump in on that when I can. Okay, key property management decisions and plans. I feel like we might have talked a little about this already, but let's just keep going. Evaluating prospective residents and tenants to determine if they meet the pre-established rental criteria. So this is a big one I like to think. So when I first started property management, I was part of the leasing team, and I like to think that leasing and property management are different. They relate, but they're different. Sometimes, depending on the property that you're managing, you may need to have an entire team just focused on leasing up the building, especially when you have a new construction and you're doing a lease up. You want to make sure you balance kind of the responsibilities and functions of property management and the day-to-day operations of a building, which, and when you're dealing with a new construction, you're probably more focused on stabilization, which is just making sure that everything is organized and in good order and all those types of things. And then you may have like a lease up team that comes in to lease X amount of units by a certain time period. Like, for example, when we would open new buildings, I did a contract with Catholic Housing Services. And when we opened up a new building, we brought over an entire team, which is basically, property managers from other buildings, to come focus on lease up for like the first 2 weeks of a new building opening to, go through all the compliance, work through the pre-screening criteria. I think that definitely having the rental criteria up front is important. I think that kind of, in my opinion, kind of goes with the management plan, especially if you have a new building. But really understanding that criteria, which it also again helps you inform what your tenant profile is going to look like, and what this particular tenant might look like. And just as a quick practical example, so if you have a building, we have I'll use one that I'm doing now. So we're doing we're selling, it's actually a home ownership project, but we're selling, they relate. We have 10 units of essentially condos that we're selling, new construction in Rainier Valley. And based on the cost of the homes, someone would need to make around 70,000 a year to be able to qualify. So when you think about that, you kind of ask yourself, okay, what does the buyer profile look like for someone who has an income of 70,000 plus? And you might think of people like, okay, someone who works in like a teaching profession, maybe a grocery store managers, healthcare administrators. When you kind of look at it like that, then it also helps inform your marketing plan, but then also it can help inform you in terms of the type of person that would qualify for your project. And so you could just make sure that you're allocating your time and resources to finding and identifying those people who will qualify, so you're not necessarily wasting time on someone who would not qualify based on the criteria. Let's see, point B, when to escalate issues to asset manager. So I've seen management plans, a lot of management plans that have, reporting expectations, and it's very typical and standard to have a monthly management report that would go to the asset manager and or owner of a property. That kind of hits on main points like, rent collection, expenditures for the month, vacancies, notices of move out, delinquency, things like that every month as a report to the asset manager. Because again, I don't like surprises when it comes to property management. And so the more you keep your asset manager and owner informed of what's going on, if and when something happens, it's not like a blind slide. You have it documented in the monthly management report. And then, based on how often you have staff meetings, is also a good time to keep your asset manager informed of what's going on in the building.
And Katisha, I might sort of tie those two back to that risk and responsibility, right? Like if there is something that when you talk about delinquency, like there's basic reporting on it, but it's like when you have increasing levels of delinquency much farther than you know what's going on with anybody, that has a risk, right? That has a risk of poor financial performance going forward. So those are the kind, those are the categories where you're thinking about what is it important to report up. Responsibilities. Oh, we have our monthly, the quarterly report is due to our investor coming up. We don't have some of the pieces that are available, or the insurance was supposed to be renewed and it's not renewed. Like those are the kinds of things that are absolutely critical, sort of looping back to those, what comes in the category of risk and responsibility slides.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, evaluate potential service providers and make a recommendation. So like your service providers, okay, again, if you outsource maintenance or you have a janitorial contract, or you're probably not going to do too much with your elevator people if you have elevators in your building. But it really just is about seeing if you're working with contractors or subcontractors that are providing good service. They're good to work with. They are responsive. In property management, it's all about responsiveness. And it took me time to learn this, because when someone reports something with whether it's maintenance and repair related, facilities related, you have to respond like immediately. You just can't delay, because a leak can turn into a real bigger issue if you kind of delay on something like that. So if we're working with subcontractors that have provided good service, they're really responsible, they're trustworthy, you annually, at least at the very least, would make a recommendation to continue working with the subcontractor. Or maybe you want to think about getting other bids or estimates, or doing interviews with other options if a subcontractor is not working out. Like, for example, I mentioned that I'm fixing like multiple fences right now for multiple car crashes. And I won't name the name, but the fencing company that we're looking to work with, they're unfortunately not responsive. And right now it's kind of hard because I like to think a lot of organizations, businesses are having staffing problems just generally. And so that could affect your response time, in managing a building, so on and so forth. So just, making sure that you're working with people who could, help and support and respond in a timely manner, and that, their prices are in line with the market. And then I like to think, when you have a good subcontractor, do what you can to keep them. Because it's just one of those markets to where, there's good folks and there's not so good folks. And if you have some good folks, hold on to them. Preventative maintenance plans. It's another thing. It kind of, relates to, understanding the capital needs of the building. Say, for example, in a property condition report, you say, okay, this roof is going to need repair. And I keep talking about a roof because that's just kind of what I'm dealing with right now. But we have to decide if, we need to replace a roof. But there is a chance that we meaning, representing the owner, may not replace the roof for another, 5 years. But the roof does leak. And, is there something that we can do in the interim of those, 5-year spans to, mitigate the amount of leaks, or, where the leak is leaking to? We can put something in place for that. So kind of preventing a further, more expensive repair until we reach that point where we're replacing the roof. Another example as a preventative maintenance plan could be, let's see, what's a good one? Leaks in residential units. We I don't know how we keep ending up with these older buildings. I think we just like the character and integrity and the story behind older buildings. But one of the older buildings that we're actually looking to acquire, they leak from floor to floor because the resident isn't putting the shower curtain inside the tub. I mean, small things like that could lead to major, maintenance and repair issues. And so, one of the things that we're thinking about is, we're looking at, is the flooring caulked well around the tub? Do we need to put it, signage, reminders? What can we do to try and prevent as many leaks as possible? So, it takes creativity to kind of think about those things, and practicality. Definitely work with your maintenance and facilities person to develop those plans. Don't go at it alone because they really are the experts. In my mind, they are. But putting those plans in place could help save money and time and resources and really just stress and headaches for everyone when you think about those things ahead of time.
One
Next.
other thing I wanted to add to that, Katisha, is some of the HVAC systems that are being put into buildings these days are very, very technical. And I think,
Mhm.
in that instance, long gone are the days where you could have, a skilled maintenance person sort of overseeing that. So when I think about these preventative maintenance plans, that's something that's high on the list. That is something that you may need to outsource. And we have some folks that we've worked with in the past that tried to do it internally, and they ended up just completely unbalancing the system and creating computer control issues that necessitated like complete replacement. So it's sort of
Mm.
that, pound wise, penny foolish kind of a situation. So that's just something else, to think about, is being realistic about, some of these components and if it's appropriate for, internal staff to maintain those items, or if that's a good third party vendor.
Yeah, absolutely, Caroline. I don't think I don't think I've had HVAC internal before. I mean, unless you're, managing just a large, like shopping center or
Mhm.
something like that, where you have technicians as part of your staffing. But HVAC is definitely one of those things that it's a specialization
Absolutely.
in that particular type of expertise. So you don't want to play around, with these types of things because especially HVAC, again, they're just really important. So I would always err on the side of caution and wisdom in terms of making sure that you have the appropriate professionals on
Think it
board
through.
with various
Think
things.
it
Yeah.
through. Exactly.
Okay, next slide. So, okay, there are some areas where asset and property management concerns overlap. Yes, absolutely. Again, it really depends on the type of portfolio you're managing. We are managing properties now where we're doing both asset management and property management. But again, when you're overseeing a larger portfolio of properties or so, these two roles are very much most likely different, but they can overlap. Tenant relation issues, this is one of those things. Again, I just thinking back to my days back in the market, but i I being a person who kind of likes to just, my personality is, go getter, I can, take care of it, things like that. I learned very quickly that you want to make sure that your boss always knows what's going on, because if something could happen, for example, there would always be like tenant conflicts down at the market, as you all might imagine. It could turn into a bigger issue, and then you just don't want your boss to find out something that they didn't know before. It's just not a good thing. So um particularly, again, if there's two tenants who are having issues, let's see if I can come up with a practical example off the top of my head. I used to have two tenants who would always fight. And the kind of fights that they were in was more territorial related. And you see this all, times with, residential, even single family home folks, where is your property line, and your tree is on my side of the property, and all types of things. Um, some of it may seem, petty, I guess, but what could potentially happen is, there could be a real issue. Like, for example, if someone, gosh, I'm sorry, I might be thinking on the fly, but there's so many examples. Um, uh, I have to think about it. But tenants, especially when you're in a shopping center, well, maybe not the newer ones, but where I was at in the market, we always had tenant relation issues. Most of them had to do with territory and who could do this on my side and who could do that on your side. And making sure that, if you're in a shopping center, everyone's keeping up with their hours, because if a tenant, is closed or a business is closed, um, prior to, maybe like a 5 p.m. Close of business time, it could it could maybe have an effect, a negative one, on their neighbors, businesses, like especially commercial businesses. Again, this is not really residential related, but commercial businesses like for their neighbors to keep up, the expectations relative to, keeping the front of your storefront clean. If you have, oh, here's an example. Like we had one business, it was a donut shop, and they just had a line that was it was just great business, but their line was so long, it just kind of encumbered upon the neighbor's space. And so we would always get calls about, the neighbor complaining about the other neighbor, and just being aware of what's going on. And then also, when you're understanding, how tenants are interacting with each other, even if it's in a negative way, you're really going to need to understand kind of the root cause of the issue, because you can make a determination on, the level of importance it is, or the issue could grow into another issue. Again, we had issues with lines, and so one of the things we had to do was we would have to, like, I forget those poles that you would put up to basically kind of guide the crowd away from the blocking the neighbor's storefront, those types of things. When you have to make management decisions on how you're going to address certain issues, you just want to be aware of how tenants are relating to others, and things of that nature. Annual budget preparation, we kind of talked about that already, so I won't go over that again. But again, that's just, planning annually for your budget and your forecasting of rents, so you can kind of know what to expect for a property, and then as well as capital needs. Crisis management. Okay, yeah, this is kind of where I might have been getting to. Crisis management. I shouldn't laugh, but again, I'm having a nostalgia from Pike Place Market, because we had a lot of crises. We had a lot of crises down at the market. Let me see if I can pick one that's appropriate for this room. We had there was a lot of fights. Fighting is a big thing when you're working in a shopping center with a lot of people, a lot of crowds. You can have fights from the public, potentially could lead to injury if, someone gets hurt. We had a security department, so we didn't address a lot of the frontline issues in terms of crisis, but we were informed. And then also we were, in many times, sought out to support a de-escalation of a crisis, because we had the relationship with the tenants, and could, maybe de-escalate a situation. Again, if you're working in a shopping center, people can be territorial. It's just can be a whole thing. But for shopping center related properties, if you have security, is a big deal, especially now, when you're dealing with, the public as well as your tenant, and then also trying to make sure that you maintain a secure environment as best possible, with the things that you can control, understanding that you can't control everything. Having a security response in place, set up, to, prevent, things from escalating and turning into, crisis situation. We also had, a heavy operations department, which again, I have a respect for operations, because they make sure that, properties and the communities in which they reside are operating and functioning well, to allow for the property management to kind of focus on the day-to-day things, and then also assist with crises. There's so much here. I feel like I'm not really pinpointing on a specific thing that people could take away from that. But again, depending on what kind of portfolio of properties or assets you're managing, your crisis response and our management is going to be customized for that. Key stakeholder relationships. Let's see, this one here is really just about knowing who's who, in my opinion. I'll reference again the work at the market. We had a lot of stakeholders. For example, when I think of stakeholders, I'm thinking of the operations department, I'm thinking of maintenance, I'm thinking of facilities, I'm thinking of security. And I'm thinking of, their tenants and your neighbors and who can be influential in being able to respond to the needs of a tenant or the needs of the shopping center. Who can you call for help and assistance? Because for the most part, people want to make sure that things are operating well, that you're in a safe environment, that everyone is kind of doing the right thing for the benefit of all involved. And so me personally, I had a really good relationship with the market community. In fact, I spent probably more than half my time outside talking to the businesses, interacting with our operations and security department. And so I got like frontline information that you may not get, sitting in an office. And again, it kind of depends on the portfolio that you're managing. But what that did was, one, I was able to gain trust over time with the businesses, and having a relationship with your tenant is really important. And then also with these various other departments, because if and when there was a crisis that happened or an issue, because of the relationships that I had with these other departments, I was able to kind of expedite or have my tenants issues prioritized within those departments. So really kind of knowing who's who and where to go to kind of leverage their influence and expertise, and really about building relationships, because you are going to need these people at some point. And so when I think of key stakeholder relationships, that's kind of what I think of: relationship building, to be able to come together and work together on an issue. That's what I think of. And Christine and Carolyn, feel free to speak from your standpoint on that. But
Yeah, I was just going to add, to be thinking also about the stakeholders that are your financial stakeholders. So lenders, owners, investors, whatever that group may be, sort of balancing a lot of things out in the role of manager. And also, a property manager needs to be aware of some of this as well.
right. Okay, I think we have 2 more slides. I feel like I've been talking so much,
That's okay. We do have 2 more slides, and then we'll have a quick Q&A and take a break and come back
okay.
and wrap up.
Okay, well, let me go quickly, because I think I'm running out of steam and I need a second cup of coffee.
Okay.
Predicting the future without a crystal ball. Yeah. So this is about everything. In my opinion, this is about everything that we put in that long-term and short-term plan that may not be in the long-term or short-term plan, but trying to predict it, the probability that something may happen that you may or may not have planned for. So experience and knowledge are key. Absolutely. In my opinion, I think I'm thankful every day for my experience at the market. I really think that that's, the 10 years, I like to think that the 10 years I spent there kind of set me up for the rest of my career. I think I've gone through anything and everything that one could go through there. And so I'm just thankful for that experience and knowledge. There was a lot involved in that, period of time. And so, anything you can do to gain experience, whether you're getting education, training, talking to other people in the industry about what they've done, or, maybe changes that they would make, or just, getting their mentorship is really valuable in this industry, for sure. Stay on top of all the details of the property. Absolutely. That management plan is really important. Those monthly reports are really important. Just know anything and everything about the property as you can, so you could, again, predict what could occur in your building. The owner's really dependent on you to do that. Monitor and maintain building systems. This is a big one. Again, if you manage older properties like I tend to do, your building systems and the maintenance of them are really important. We had a commercial building that, again, had a basement flood. The city had actually acquired this building, and then what we didn't know when we assumed it, but found out very quickly, is that the sump pumps are required to pump the water out of the basement, which happens to flood quite often. And so if you have an opportunity to really understand that in the beginning, do so. Otherwise, you're gonna just kind of be in a reactive state, which you don't really want to do. And then have a plan with your maintenance and facilities folks to make sure that they're monitoring and maintaining them pretty frequently. Effective revenue management is key. Absolutely. This is the really understanding your rent roll, who's paying rent, when they're paying it, who's getting behind in rent, making sure that you're executing a repayment plan, helping the tenant stay on the payment plan. Um, it's really important because, people, especially the asset manager, they plan long-term and short-term for the building based on those revenues. And people like to know how much money they're earning and when they're going to have it, and so they can plan with it. So definitely key. Definitely have a plan in place when you're doing rent collection. If you have rent due on the 1st and you give them to the 5th, uh, at 9 a.m. on the 6th, you should be making calls to people. And it could be, tedious collection processes, but it's really important. You just want to stay on it for sure. And, just again, depending on who your property manager is, just having, skills to be able to work with people. Because if you work with people, I think that they'll work with you for the most part. And then just kind of being able to foresee how a specific tenant is going to, respond or, correct an issue, those types of things. Understand what your competition has to offer. This is really important, particularly as it comes to, I would say, the lease up process. And then also, if you're just noticing, an increase in vacancy in your building, you want to know where you stand relative to other housing options. Uh, Not just housing options. We can talk office, which I don't think is a problem now in the office market, but just knowing where you stand as it relates to other buildings, because if you're in a market where people have options, you have a building where their maybe their floor plan layout is a lot better or so, and their rent is cheaper, they have more amenities, whatever it is, you just really want to know where you stand relative to your competition so you could make informed decisions about how you're managing your property. Understand ultimate goals of the property owner. This is a big one. Again, what are the objectives of the owner? Why are they buying this building? Why are they, what are they looking to achieve? Are they, and it could vary. Kristen and Caroline, feel free to jump in on this one. Again, my head is knee deep in property management, so I kind of head back out. But
Yeah, I
yeah,
think, when we think about the property owner, it is very important to understand sort of what their goals are, because you are, tasked with maintaining the property in a way that will help that owner achieve those goals. So if the goal is for the owner to come in and to maybe to do a refresh or rehabilitation of the property and then wait for the market to improve and sell, that could change, your asset management view of different items within the building, like that need to be replaced or not replaced. If it's shorter term, it's different than if an owner is holding that property for the very, very long term. Then instead of replacing, the washer and dryers with something, state of the art that's going to last a lot longer, maybe your goal is, from a cash flow perspective, let me spend less because I know the owner's going to sell the building in 2 years, and they're not going to get any more or less just because the quality of the laundry equipment is different. So just make sure that you're on the same page, is very important.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Attend industry conferences, webinars, networking opportunities. Um, I like to think this is good, but I like to think that experience is better. In knowledge is better. For those like me who learn by doing, this is where I again gain the breadth of my experience and knowledge is really just doing the work and having a team of other coworkers, your boss, so on and so forth, to share their knowledge and experience and support in your job. Um, Again, it's not bad to attend conferences, webinars, and networking training like this. But for me, it particularly it's just been about doing. Um, and so I'll just say that. But again, there's anytime you can take advantage of gaining more education and training,
Right.
definitely
Do
do
it.
so.
Do it.
Definitely do
And
so.
also, some folks are in positions where maybe you're a little more isolated from your peers. And so that's where maybe an industry
Yeah,
conference, or a networking opportunity might be beneficial, just to learn a little bit more information and keep yourself, at the front lines of the business.
right. Absolutely. Okay, next slide. I think this is the last one before we break and take questions. So,
Correct.
important asset management skills, property management experience. Yes, I think you can. Maybe Kristen, you could affirm this or not, but I think the best asset managers have had property management experience. Forgive me
I
if
I agree with that,
Yeah.
Katisha. I mean, the folks that
Okay.
are on our asset management team at Grow America, they all have some aspect of property management in their background. And it just helps you, I think, have a better opportunity or better understanding and be more relatable, when you are out in the field working with property managers, because you've been there and you understand, the inherent challenges with that day-to-day property management.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you
Absolutely.
did that step.
And I think property management is something that is extraordinarily experiential to learn, right? It is about
Mhm.
encountering things and all the different things that you encounter. And then what you're doing is in asset management, you're sort of bringing these tools, financial tools, accounting tools, planning tools, marketing tools to bear to match with that experience and terms of how you both utilize those tools and interpret the tools in the reports. So
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Don't skip that step. Especially if you want to be really good at your job. Definitely gain some property management experience. In fact, again, my experience led to development, and then we opened up our asset management because of that. Because our clients like us to then, once the building is built and stabilized, to actually manage the building from an asset management standpoint. And so it really, I think, a lot of real estate comes back to this, and it's just really a good foundation in whatever area of real estate management and or development you find yourself in. Property management is like one of those things that you earn your stripes in for sure. Understanding of finance, accounting, business law, organizational management, and insurance. Yes, to all of that. Um, if you have, experience in business with which covers all of these kind of aspects, they all lend very well to property management for certain. And then also, if you have, good personnel skills, just being personal with people, what do they call it, soft skills or inter I don't know all
Interpersonal
the
skills, yes.
interpersonal. There it is.
Yes.
If you have good interpersonal skills, that's always helpful. I mean, I personally, just me, have been able to accomplish a whole lot just on the fact that been able to establish, build, and maintain good relationships. You really can
Absolutely.
get more done with that. And so, just as a note there. Certification programs related to asset management. So these are three major certifications that you can get. The IREM, Institute of Real Estate Management, CPM, Certified Property Manager. I don't know a whole lot about the ARM program.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
the CPM is more commercial based, but also helpful in all types of asset management. And then the ARM it's accredited residential manager. It's really more beneficial for folks that are managing, residential properties, and that's actually a good accreditation for someone who's a property manager. Not that
Mhm.
it's bad for an asset manager to go for that as well. Another one that I'll add to the list, we do a lot with CHAM, which is the Consortium for Housing and Asset Management. So they have a
Mhm.
really good training program, especially if you have affordable housing in your portfolio. You can reach two different levels. The first is an asset management specialist, and the second builds off of that to become a full CHAM asset manager. So
Mhm.
those are some good ones. They have good conferences every year as well. So just some ideas for you, something maybe you could take a look at if you had a need or the opportunity in the future.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say, anyone who really sees their career in asset management or property management, and I would definitely encourage them to get the certification. You just it definitely can help you, and it definitely cannot harm you. Um,
Absolutely.
for sure. And so, it adds to your credentials. It helps boost your resume if ever you are looking to, transfer to a different company or what have you. When you have those certifications and credentials, it just puts you in a whole nother category. So
It does.
definitely encourage people to seek out those certifications. Okay, so I think I made it.
You made it. You made it. We're at the Q&A part for this section. So I would say if anyone has a question up to this point, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. We'll also have a Q&A at the very end. So if you wanted to wait till that point as well, that is fine. And does anyone have anything that you'd like to ask of Katisha or any of us at this point? I hope that you're enjoying the presentation so far. I think that the stories that folks can tell, really are quite meaningful. This particular building that's on the screen is a project that we've invested in probably about 8 years ago. It's a senior project in Vicksburg, Mississippi, which had some interesting challenges which were resolved, but we'll talk about maybe some of those as we go through the slides. So we can get to the next slide. Okay, and so when we think about asset management, it doesn't begin at the point that a building is fully leased up or construction is, completely finished. The earlier that you can insert yourself into the process, the better, because an asset manager, again, is thinking about that long term. And it could be something as simple as, some of the finishes in a new construction or even a rehab building, that if you could have influence over at the beginning, could save dollars through operations and aggravation throughout the years. And when we're looking at new deals that our originations team brings to us to look at, we ask questions about some of those items. How old is the roof? How old are the windows? We ask a lot of questions. We probably drive them nuts about the finishes on the floors, because obviously, if you've got a lot of carpeting in common areas, that is just, a lot of maintenance in terms of cleaning on the short term, but certainly, a big expense for replacement on the long term. So again, try to get in there as soon as you can. Hopefully the organization that you work for, understands how critical asset management is to the overall project. But you really want to get in there during that startup period because you can, again, using that example of the flooring, make a difference for the long term with this. And certainly at the beginning, you're wanting to make sure you're directing and making sure that the policies and practices are set up. So we talked about, a marketing plan. We talked about the management plan. We want to make sure that everything is very organized, and it's really up to you as the asset manager to set that tone and that expectation. We want to make sure that there's, a system in place that is properly tracking revenue, that the property manager knows exactly when to start knocking on the door, as we talked about before. And also, the more planning that goes into a project, it really does help for expenses to be a little bit more predictable. There's always something that's variable, and you just can't expect it. But again, we try to mitigate surprises. That's one of the most important things that we're doing. So that clear communication that Katisha was talking about before, building those relationships, those soft skills are really so important. And, even in our role as asset managers on the investment side, the relationships that we have with our general partners, but as well the property management staff on site are really helpful. And something as simple as taking someone out to lunch once in a while, they're going to relax a little bit, maybe tell you some things that, you need to know that you weren't hearing from another source. So it really is important to have that good communication. And we touched on this previously, just understanding what the owner's objectives are for the property in that timeline, again, helps you to make some decisions going forward. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So we're looking at this cycle of life, right? So we're starting at the top with acquisition and development. We don't have anything to manage from a property management perspective or an asset management perspective until the project is completed or rehabbed or acquired, not necessarily in that order. We've talked about sort of this cycle a little bit already, but leasing is an important component, making sure that you understand when the construction piece is finished so that you can start to get people lined up to move in the building as soon as possible, and having a realistic expectation of what that date or dates, if there's multiple buildings, will be. You don't want to disappoint people who have applied, for residency and or even on the commercial side. You need to be clear so that these businesses can make their plans accordingly. Maybe they need to, extend the lease where they are for 30 days or something. But again, that communication is really what helps keep all of that flowing. Certainly the staffing, we touched on before, making sure that you have the proper level of staffing, quality staffing, making sure that there's some parameters for operations, what the expectations are there, financial management at the property, again, the counting side, who is going to be providing the financial information to the stakeholders involved in the deal. And at some point, if it's affordable housing, the disposition is at year 15. If it's commercial, it could be at any point in time. So just understanding, again, what that timeline is. So this really gives you sort of the timeline of a project and things to think about in really that order as we're going through. But sometimes there's things that go back and forth, right? Because you could be close to the disposition stage, but maybe you have a leasing issue that you're coming back to, or there's, issues with staffing now. There's just not enough people that are interested in working for the wages that, properties usually can afford to pay. So that's a continual issue, but just be aware of these components. Next slide, please. So at startup, one of the things that I really like to emphasize is making sure that you take on the responsibility as the asset manager for collecting critical documentation. And once it's collected, there are components of that or a subset of that information that would be helpful to the property manager. But you are the person who makes sure that things are really getting off on a good front. So if it is a new project, there is going to be some sort of a project closeout report, so that it could come from the architect, it could come from the construction company, but it just talks about all of the components. You need to collect warranty information, including contact information. So you may have, Joe Smith General Contracting Company, but Joe isn't necessarily doing the plumbing, Joe isn't doing the electrical, Joe isn't doing the HVAC. There are subcontractors there. And the reason I stress this is because, you could be a few years down the road and maybe your contractor is out of business or they've reformed themselves. Maybe they're just not great at responding back to you. If you have a question about something, maybe you're starting to get some leaks around the windows and you reach out and you're just not getting any information. If you're able to have that information in hand already, that person is not holding you up. You can go forward and maybe contact that subcontractor directly and try to get some resolution to the problem before you start spending your own money. And that's what it's really all about, is making sure that you understand from the very beginning what the warranty period is for some of the key components of the building, so that you're able to go back onto the warranty if need be, instead of just automatically going from operations. And I think, without information being shared with the property manager, they're apt to just be very reactive. They've got a situation, they've got residents who are being impacted. They're just going to call someone to come and fix something. And so communicating with the property manager to make sure that they know if something happens, that they should reach out to you, maybe, if you don't want to give them the information ahead of time. But we just need to make sure that it's not something that's covered under warranty. And we have a project that we've invested in Nevada, so hot temperatures. It's a senior project, and it's just a few years old, and there are issues with the PTAC units that were installed in the individual units, and they have multiple units, or multiple, PTAC units, I should be clear, within each unit. So the problem is multiplied out. It's very expensive. And, where is the warranty on those components? So
Carolyn, will you
yes.
just describe PTAC unit for folks who may not?
Oh, I'm sorry. And I used to know the exact what the initial stood for, but it's basically if you go into a hotel and you see an individual HVAC type unit that's usually located under the window, and you can set your temperature from that, that's a PTAC unit. It's personal something. And if somebody else on the call knows, feel free to jump in. Insurance coverage, making sure, of course, during construction that there is builder's risk insurance in place. But when the property is being turned over, you need to make sure that there's building coverage, that the coverage is sufficient to replace the building if there's an entire loss. Also, liability insurance is so important. And unfortunately, we are in a very, very tough insurance market right now. And especially on the liability side, in some ways, I guess it's no surprise, it's been building up to this, but we used to have, and we still do, I shouldn't say we used to have, we have a $5 million liability minimum requirement, and it's in all of our agreements. And what we're getting some pushback on is the cost to be at that level now is really some projects that, again, we're all affordable housing at Grow America. So some of the projects have a very small operating budget or a small number of units, and it's just very difficult. So we've had to create some backstop, to cover that when there isn't the 5 million, or if they need some help in paying that premium, so that we can make sure that that coverage is in place. So
Carolyn,
yes, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in to just give a little bit of clarity of the different kinds of insurance coverages and what they cover, right? So there's builder's risk that Carolyn just said, that is when a property is under construction. So before it's completed, if something happened, if there was a flood and that stuff got damaged, then when it gets completed, and usually in asset management, you're not dealing with that because that's been finished up. And so then the two main types are property coverage, which is like something happening again with the building itself, right? So the building coverage or property coverage, sometimes it's called, there's some other
terms for it, sure.
Yeah,
there's
terms, but
there's boiler mechanicals, all different types of things.
Exactly. So those are the property, the physical nature, and then the liability that she was just describing is for those things. Somebody slips and hurts themselves and sues you as the property owner. That's the liability insurance, is the insurance that sits there to protect you against essentially harm to individuals or harm to other property that's not your building.
Right. And on the builder's risk front, still, if it's not a bad thing for you to be involved and make sure that that is in place. But again, if you're coming in at a point that's way past that, Kristen is right, that you're just going to be dealing with that property and liability insurance, which again are two separate coverages, two separate premiums. Very painful right now because insurance has gone up just incredibly over the last couple of years. Service contracts, and we touched on that again a short time ago, but just making sure that if there is, whether it's HVAC, landscaping, whatever it might be, that the contracts are in place and that you have that documentation, you provided it to the property manager. So I'll go back to the example of the washer dryers. If you are owning those, if you decided to do a buy instead of the lease, then if something happens and it's outside of the minimal warranty that you get with appliances these days, it is your expense. But if you are leasing that equipment, oftentimes that's part of your lease agreement that they agree to warranty and to repair anything that's wrong with the washers and dryers. So you wouldn't want to take any expense on yourself that really is the responsibility of someone else. So just understanding how this is all structured from the beginning is very important. Real estate tax documentation. A number of the projects that we're involved with have some sort of an abatement, but there is usually a process that folks have to go through to submit documentation once the project is complete. And that usually does roll over into asset management. You just need to make sure that that's done so that there isn't, again, a surprise when the tax bill comes. And if there is a surprise, there's usually an opportunity to appeal real estate tax bills, and sometimes that involves hiring a third party, usually a legal firm, to do that for you. Sometimes folks try to do it in-house. It's 50-50 on the success rate, I suppose.
And I would add in, like, we are actually extraordinarily fortunate here. If you're looking at doing stuff here in this region, the King County Tax Assessor's Office is one of the most
friendly,
sort of customer friendly,
that's great,
customer assistance organizations that I found among many agencies. So you really can get to individuals who will help you talk through you do the research.
Yeah. Thanks for inserting that. I really didn't know that. And I would say that is definitely outside of the norm.
Yes.
So you're all very fortunate, for sure. Okay, next slide, please. So again, continuing with our conversation about documentation, you would think, well, why would I need a site plan? Why would I need building plans? Well, if somebody's trying to trace something in the walls at some point, having the building plans are important. If there's some sort of a dispute about a property line, having the site plan and the survey, all of those documentation pieces are very important to have, at your fingertips, that you're not digging for them later. The certificate of occupancy is issued by the local authority, which gives you the permission to start occupying the property. And until you have that in hand, you cannot move in any resident, whether it's a personal resident or it's a commercial kind of situation. You absolutely can't let anyone move anything in until you have that certificate in hand. And what that means when it's inspected is that they're agreeing that all of the critical work is done, the building is sufficiently ready, have all of the life safety components in place, so you can move folks in. Sometimes you may get a TCO, which is a temporary certificate of occupancy. Maybe there's just one small thing that needs to be done. And they're saying with the TCO, okay, you can go ahead and people in, but we're not giving you the final certificate of occupancy until whatever that open item is taken care of. But rest assured, they're not going to let anybody move in, even issue a TCO if there's any life safety issues. If there is any environmental reports available, usually there are usually environmental studies that are done when any project is being newly built. Of course, if you're rehabbing and it's something that's older, you may or may not have an environmental report. And again, that might be a regional thing. Kristen, I don't know if you have any further comment on an environmental report for an existing building.
No, it's pretty standard,
okay.
Traditionally of phase one and phase two report. Yep.
Sounds good. And then life safety documentation, obviously, if there's a sprinkler system, you're going to want to make sure you have the documentation for that, including, if possible, the drawings, because that's always helpful. But usually those will require a regular inspection and sign off. So that becomes part of your budget. You need to make sure that you retain that documentation. Elevators are generally inspected once a year, and you need to have that information either in the elevator or in your office with a sign in the elevator that the certificate's available. You don't want to let that lapse. That can become an insurance issue too if you're not able to prove that you've had your elevator inspected when it needed to be. And certainly an easy one would be the fire extinguisher certificate and or invoice to show that you have that. Certainly the tags go on the fire extinguisher, so that's another piece of proof. But it always is a good idea to have some sort of a tickler calendar system where you have some of these things that need to have regular inspections on a calendar, so you can 30 days ahead of time make sure that you've got the vendor set up to take care of it, so you're not in a period of time where you have exposure where something has expired. And then the building layout plan, so that's specific to interior of the building, showing you the unit numbers, which is, again, something very helpful. And sometimes your local fire departments will appreciate having a copy of that in their files in case they receive a call. Next slide, please. Loan documentation. This is a big one. So I had mentioned before how important it is to make sure that you're responding to your stakeholders and things that they need. And we talked about this also. We were talking about the topic of reserves. So making sure that you as an asset manager understand what whoever was working in development signed up for when they signed up for the loan or loans. Some loans might be, we call hard debt, which means that it's just like your house payment. There's a principal and interest payment that's due each and every month. Other debt might be soft debt, which means that there might be some other type of contingency that would trigger a payment needing to be made. So some of the times we'll see soft debt where it is provided to the project to lower the cost of the project, and perhaps it's cash flow contingent. So if there is excess cash at the end of the year, that's calculated and some sort of a payment is made. Other soft debt may not require any type of a payment until, if it's affordable housing, until the end of the full compliance period. Sometimes they go 40 years. It just depends on the source of that particular loan. But just understand what needs to be paid and what are the requirements from a reporting perspective as well for anyone who has a loan on the property. So again, external reporting, it could go back to investors, the lenders we were just talking about, certainly the owners. There could be maybe community service organizations that have provided something to your project that they're looking for some type of reporting. It may not be financial reporting, it may be something else. But again, the idea of having something in your system that helps you to know what's due, when it's due, and who it goes to, and how you get it to them is very important. Next slide. So starting, again, we're still talking about this startup stage. So the most important thing is to make sure that you're getting off to a good start by, again, having that communication, making sure you understand what is needed. We've talked a little bit about this property management plan before, but the property management plan is sort of your guide, your overview for the property. Like, what do you think as an asset manager it's going to take to manage this property and be successful? So it goes back to the idea of making sure that you have proper staffing levels and that you've got the right folks in those positions. So say if you have 3 maintenance positions and that's appropriate for the type of building you have, the number of units that are in the building, what expertise do those individuals need to have? And maybe they don't all need to have the same expertise. Maybe there's someone who is a little better in one thing than other, but just collectively, do you have the right expertise? Because if you don't, then that's where you're going back to hiring a third party to do that, which can be a little bit more expensive. But it also could be expensive to make a mistake with your staffing and have, too many folks on the payroll. You've got to really understand what you're doing and balance all of that out. You're going to set those operational expectations. So you're not just leaving it up to the property manager to guess what you expect them to do and what you commit that you're going to do. You are documenting that ahead of time. And when your property manager is in place, you're going to review that information with the property manager, again, so everyone is on the same page. You want to make sure that you're very clear about what the goals for the property are, but also the goals for the staff at the property, which are 2 distinctly different things. What do you expect from the staff? Do you have a maintenance staff that believes that everything's going to be outsourced and they're just going to be taking calls for small maintenance things? You want to make sure that you've set the expectation up front. This is what you're going to do. This is what we might have to outsource at some point, but this is what we expect of you. Be very, very detailed, very specific. The more detailed you are, the less room there is for misinterpretation. I'll just leave it at that. Next slide, please. A fair housing plan. I mentioned this when we were talking about one of the other topics, but fair housing just makes sure that you are providing an opportunity when it comes to residential properties for a diverse population to live in the property. And you may, in fact, be required to provide that information to a stakeholder. It could be HUD. There's a formal plan for HUD that has to be developed if you have those dollars in your project. So just make sure that you're very clear, again, about the outreach and you're documenting what you've done in case something comes up and someone makes a claim against you and your practices, you're able to demonstrate that you've done everything you could to provide a good outreach and to be very fair. If you have a waiting list, and your friend's daughter or son is all of a sudden on this waiting list in spot number 20 and a unit opens up, they are not the next person that is going to be offered that unit or have the opportunity to be offered that unit. It's going to be the first person on the list. And the first person may all of a sudden not qualify if there's income restrictions. They may no longer be interested. Their family status might have changed and they may just be off of the list and you can go to number 2. But again, you're documenting all of that. So it's important for the asset manager to have some fair housing training because you need to understand what those laws are. And, some of it now, there's a lot of sensitivity around, service animals, and you need to understand what that really means. It's not someone just, buying a shirt for their dog that says, I'm a service animal. It's a little more complicated. There's some documentation. So again, you need to understand what the expectation is before you as an asset manager can make sure that the property manager is collecting that information. So having that plan and being very clear is important. Next slide. The leasing plan, again, is talking about how you're going to go about selecting your tenants. So there could be some financial considerations, like I was talking about. The rent structure is all about affordable housing, various income levels that are appropriate for that particular property. Also, what are the current market conditions? Is your property a little less desirable Do you need to expect that you're going to be charging a little bit less in rent? But you definitely want to make sure that you have that information outlined for the property manager so that they know what they should be looking for. And some of that includes background checks, and you may have certain things that are acceptable in a background check that comes back and some things that are not. So we might see properties that, say that there are no felons allowed at the property. Well, as long as you're in compliance and as long as you are consistent, that's what it's all about. Other properties may say, we'll accept felons as long as they aren't of the nature of having some sexual aggression or something like that. So you need to figure out what it is that's acceptable. And some of that could come from some of the documentation that you're looking at that came from the development side and what was said at the beginning that you were going to allow or not allow. When it comes to commercial businesses, there may be some commercial businesses that are not appropriate. And you could see, some mixed use properties where there's commercial on the bottom and there's residential on the top. Do you want a strip club on the first level if you have a family project on the higher levels? Probably not. So again, just being very clear about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. Would you want to have a marijuana business in a commercial building that's all commercial? Your other commercial tenants may not appreciate that. So again, it's consistency, and it's being clear in advance what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So make sure that you have that in your leasing plan so there's no miscommunication or confusion. Next slide. So you want to make sure, again, that you're developing that resident and or tenant services plan. You're developing a compliance plan if there is, in fact, a component that requires some income restrictions. So we have a very, broad system at Grow America where we're like the recheckers. So our folks that we're investing with, they go through and they do the tenant files. There's a lot of restrictions. Those files come to us. We send them to a third party. They look at the files and make sure that all the documentation is in there, because you could be out of compliance and you could lose tax credit. So for affordable housing projects, that's a very, very important piece of that structure. And then the asset management plan, again, is just being clear about what is what. It's you're doing this, I'm doing this, and here are the parameters of this project. The more that you can spell out for yourself and for your asset manager, your property manager, is very important. And then some other things to think about at the beginning, of course, is how it's a business. How are you running this business? What equipment might you need on site? What databases might you need, or software that you need? Usually you're going to have some sort of financial management software, obviously, but maybe your corporate office is handling that piece. So again, understanding who's doing what and what needs to be done at the property versus at a corporate level. Make sure that you've got everything in place at the very beginning so that you're not behind the 8 ball with a bunch of paper files and you're losing track of where you are with things. You really just want to make sure things are off to a good start. And I think the less confusion there is, on site, because you provided all this great guidance, the happier your employees are going to be and the happier you're going to be. It's just going to be a lot easier. If there's an on-site management office, it could need the furniture, internet service, and all of that. If you don't have an on-site management office, what does that mean? Where do potential residents or tenants come to get signed up, and how do they know how to reach you? And is somebody coming to the property on a certain day if somebody wants to come and sign a lease somewhere? You don't want somebody to pull up and be signing leases on the back of a car. Like, that happens, but if you have a better plan, I think, in place in advance, that's very helpful. Next slide. So commercial asset management versus residential. There are a lot of similarities between the two, but there are differences in how you're going to go about some of this. And obviously, Kristen has a lot of commercial experience, and maybe jumping in, and Katisha as well on the residential side. But how you manage the project and even staff the project is a little different. If you have a large commercial building that is office based, You might have a security desk that's a 24-hour operation. Obviously, you wouldn't have that necessarily in a residential structure, but you could. The leases are structured a little bit differently. As was mentioned before, residential leases are generally 12 months in nature, and then they roll to usually a month to month after that. And in sort of like non-affordable, they might have a structure where they're going to give you a reduced rent. You're going to offer a reduced rent if somebody signs like another lease. But in a commercial building, you are going to see longer term leases, and usually they're going to have options for renewal, whether those are 2 or 3 3-year options or a couple of 5-year options. That's something that you don't see in a residential lease that you do see in a commercial lease. And again, just sort of overall how you go about managing is a little bit different. A commercial building, there's often, cleaning that's involved. So you've got folks coming into the building at night, entering spaces. You've got to make sure that you've got everything structured. And usually they will use like a third party to do the cleaning, making sure that they have the proper insurance. Where you're not going to have that generally in the residential building. You might have somebody that's on staff that's cleaning, but they're cleaning usually during the day hours. And these, again, are just generalities, but that's sort of what you see. And it's important to understand, again, that the commercial lease is going to be generally longer term, and it's going to have different types of accelerators on the payment front than you would see in a residential lease. Next slide, please.
Carolyn, just to jump in for a brief moment too, what I think increasingly, particularly in the Seattle area, we're seeing more and more mixed use buildings. And so if you are, and in particular, mixed use buildings that are a mix of affordable housing, which has a certain set of regulatory requirements or parameters around it, that then have a services organization or more traditional retail users at the base of the building. And so if you are an asset manager of a building like that, it's important to really understand both sides of that piece and how those things come to play. The commercial spaces may be operated under, if it's a tax credit partnership for the housing, for the affordable housing, then the commercial spaces, anything that's not residential, may be managed under a different ownership entity, but it's all part of one building. And so starting to understand and think about how your budgets work for the commercial entity versus the housing entity and the relationships between the two is becoming an increasingly important thing that you're seeing in asset management in this
Absolutely.
arena.
Absolutely. Thank you for those comments. I appreciate that. And I mentioned before about the commercial leasing, leases may, have certain provisions regarding these rental increases. So these are some of the different options that you could see in a commercial lease. So the very easiest is just a standard preset rent increase. So your rent is $1,000 a month for the first 60 months, and then it's going to go up to $1,200. Easy to understand, very simple. This next one, it still gives me the shudders. Early in my career, I worked for a commercial real estate firm in the property management area, and we worked through the calculation of escalation mathematically using algebra, which I swore I never thought I would need to use in my adult life, but that was not the case. But escalation means that there's sort of a baseline that's established for expenses, including real estate taxes and insurance, when you first sign your lease. And so your lease may say your rent is $1,000 a month, and your rent is going to escalate at the end of each calendar year by a certain percentage. And so what is done is there's a comparison of what the expenses were when you signed your lease versus what they are at the end of the first year. And say the operating expenses for the property, including taxes and insurance, went up by 6%, you are going to share pro-ratally in that increase along with all of the other tenants in the building. So it can become a very complicated calculation. And usually folks will send that out to their CPAs to have them recheck it just to make sure. But again, that's a little more complicated. A third option, usually you'll see this in retail, is that your rent is $1,000 a month, but starting month one, if your gross sales are above $30,000, for every dollar it's above that amount, a certain percentage is going to come back to the owner as additional rent. And that's a very common practice, but what's hard with that is that you have tenants who may be the smaller mom and pops that are trying to cook the books a little bit. So from an owner's perspective, it's a little difficult to try to to make sure that you're getting exactly the right rent there. You're really relying on your tenants who provide accurate information. And to be honest, common area maintenance is pretty simple. It's looking at your base rent of $1,000 a month. I'll continue to use that as an example, and then whatever those common area expenses are. So common hallway cleaning, common restroom cleaning, landscaping, replacement of light bulbs, whatever it might be. All of those expenses are aggregated, and as a tenant in that particular building, you're setting yourself up to be paying a percentage of that based upon the square footage that you're occupying. And again, all identified, in the lease. And triple net is very simple. Do you have an example, Kristen, of triple net lease? Do you use those very often? Or do you see them very often?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So in the commercial of a couple of mixed use projects that commercial aspects. So these are a mix of both sort of services tenants and restaurant tenants, but right, the triple net lease has is a bill back for the taxes of the property. Fortunately, in this particular property in the ID, it's benefiting from a historic tax abatement, so the real estate taxes are particularly low. That's countered by what Carolyn was just talking about with insurance, right? Our insurance rate went up 45% year over year last year. So, and that is billed back to those tenants, to the commercial tenants, their share of that insurance increase for both that property and liability coverage.
So in that instance, I would just jump in and say, so from an owner's perspective, having a lease structured that way is good, because you're not bearing the brunt of these increases, right?
Right.
But from the tenant perspective, you've got this wild card that you have no control over. You're not the one placing the insurance. You have no control over those things, but yet financially you're impacted with whatever that number is each year as it goes up.
Exactly. And for this building, for instance, right, a large majority of that building it's a mix of the retail tenants and residential tenants. And so the ownership does carry that increase fully on the residential side. So, because there aren't those mechanisms. So,
okay, next slide. So again, from a staffing perspective, just be aware residential properties are going to require more maintenance staff hours than commercial properties. Commercial properties are I think, so much easier to manage than residential for many reasons. Residential properties usually don't have security on staff. However, there are some particular properties that may have a concentration of, say, formerly homeless or whatever the example is that you would want to think of, where it's more of a vulnerable population. And so they may require security just to make sure that everyone stays safe. And we usually see that is provided by an outside vendor, because there is some inherent liability on you as an owner to provide that service. So usually we recommend that you outsource that. Okay, and next slide, please. So it really rolls back to the idea that it's so important for you as an asset manager to be at the property during lease up and the early portion of operations to make sure that everything is flowing. So you've developed all of these plans, you've hired your staff, you've sat down, you've gone through all of these, documents with your staff. So the expectations are there. There shouldn't be any confusion, but you just don't sort of, wipe your hands and go on to the next thing. You need to be there to make sure that everything is being implemented, as you have directed. And being there is the best thing to do. You can manage some information from your desk. You can have phone calls, you can have team meetings, but again, it's that soft skill, that interpersonal skill. Like, you're going to find out a lot more by being at the property. And that's why we have this little character looking through, the magnifying glass, because you're going to see a lot more and hear a lot more when you're there at the property. And also, again, that gives you that opportunity to build on and strengthen those relationships that you have with the staff. Okay, next slide. We're going to actually skip the next slide because that was the break. We just kind of combined and had one break. So I'm going to turn the presentation now back over to Katisha, and we're going to just get through, the rest of this. Katisha, again, we can shorten this by stopping at the staffing piece if you'd like to. We have about 5 minutes left, and we want to be able to have a chance to give people the opportunity to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking, and maybe Kristen would agree. I'm thinking we stop now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, why don't we pick up leasing and staffing, which are at the beginning of next Tuesday's bit, and have an
that sounds
opportunity for
fine.
questions, I think.
That sounds fine. Okay, a great alternative plan. Good thinking. So I think what we'd like to do then is just go ahead and open it back up to any questions that you might have. And we'll put this leasing and staffing for the next, I think just in our conversation, we've covered quite a bit of that anyhow, but we'll make sure that we go through it when we reconvene next Tuesday. But does anyone have a question that they would like to bring forth? Either by going off mute or by putting in the chat box, either method is acceptable.
Or also just elements that you feel like if there's anything that you feel like we went through too quickly today and you'd like us to share a little more information or focus more on as we go forward, please let us know that as well, so that we can think about how to pack it in our next 2 days.
That sounds good. And maybe people are still thinking. I'll just go ahead and sort of like queue up our next session for us, and we'll switch back to Q&A if there's anything that comes up, certainly. So our next date that we're going to get together is next Tuesday, November 7th. During that session, we're going to talk about operations in a little more depth. And one of my favorite topics, having an accounting background, is the financial management piece. I'll try not to put you to sleep. Property disposition, which is always so fun to think about that when we're starting to talk about operations and getting things up and running. We also are going to have a guest speaker. Her name is Paula Liu. Paula works on our Grow America team. She actually is based in Seattle, and she has a residential and commercial background. She has property management background, as well as she's an asset manager, not under my team, which is affordable housing, but under one of our other programs that Grow America has that we'll talk a little bit more about when we meet her next Tuesday. So I don't see any questions yet, but again, if you think of anything at all between now and the next time that we get together, just as we're starting off next week, just jump in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask us. I mean, our goal is not to be so rigid with sort of the slides, so to speak, but make sure that we're meeting your needs and answering your questions. And I think, the sharing of stories is a great way to, to really resonate some of this information so that you really can remember what it's all about when it's time for you to use some of this. So we will stop here. And I just want to say we appreciate your time today, and we look forward to speaking with you again next Tuesday.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
You.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.